This is Connections, and today my connection is Rienk de Vries. Welcome, Rienk.
Thank you.
Let's get this first part out of the way. For years, you've had your own company. Is Beacon 2020?
Yep.
So what do you do?
We focus really on transformation of the water industry. So I've been in the water industry for probably 25, 26 years, and maybe even a little bit longer than that. I may not want to admit all the years, right. But really from a technology background to start with. So after getting my civil engineering degree at the University of Minnesota and getting an MBA, I joined what was at the time called Arthur Andersen and now called Accenture. So joined them in the consulting division, and really the focus was on IT. A couple of years later, I went back to my civil engineering roots and really started focusing on water, sort of the application of technologies in the water industry, mainly in the Midwest in the U.S. to start with, but then also out west, Seattle, Portland, all the way to Boston.
Okay, now that's not how I know you, however. Nope. We kind of live in the same neighborhood, which it's a fun neighborhood because there's all these interesting people to talk to. But when I first met you, you're one of my kids' soccer coach. So you're a soccer player, fanatic. And then I learned that you played. I remember remembering that you played in an adult league, right? You're very active. You coached and you played. But then I was startled to find out that you were a goalie. You were playing, nothing against goalies or drummers or anything like that. But I did find that kind of odd. Why were you playing goaltender instead of like midfielder or, streaking, sprinting forward?
I started playing goalie when I was probably 8 or 9. I played in Holland, then I played in Belgium just as a kid, and then moved to the U.S. and played there, junior high school, back to Belgium, and I played soccer there at the International School of Brussels, and I also played for a local Belgian team, and then I went back to university in the States and played there as well. At the time, soccer wasn't as big in the States, so it was still called a club. It didn't have sort of varsity status yet.
So the answer I thought you were going to give is because of your, there was a physical condition as well, right?
That sort of came later, where I liked to play in goal. I also played a little bit out, where I played usually on the right defense. But there was a certain point when I couldn't play defense anymore, and that was when I turned 37. We had just moved to Canada. And I thought, wow, I don't know what's wrong with me. I need to work out more. I didn't have the energy anymore. We had just had our first child, and even carrying him became difficult. And so I decided, well, you know what? I'm just not feeling right. I'm going to get this checked out. And I got to the hospital, and immediately they threw me onto a gurney, onto a bed, and they did all kinds of tests. They thought I'd had a massive heart attack. My heart rate had gone into the 20s and low 30s. As it turns out, after sort of maybe 5-6 days of tests and checks and I ended up going to Hamilton Hospital, back to Oakville Trafalgar Hospital. They found out I had a conduction problem, and they didn't really know what the root cause was at the time, but the solution was they stuck in a pacemaker. So once they stuck in that pacemaker, you could program that pacemaker to still allow you to do lots of physical activity. So at the time, I had to step back a little bit from more of the running, because what happens is the technology in the pacemakers is limited. So at the time, they had in the relationship, I guess, between exercise and the way the pacemaker is speeding up your heart rate wasn't exact, which seemed to function just fine for a while.
For how long is a while? Maybe for a few years kind of thing?
Yeah, I'd say I had the pacemaker in for about 17 years, but I'd say after probably 13, 14 years, it became more of a problem. Like my condition continued to get worse, and I continued to have a more and more difficult time.
Yes. Now, I remember you being like fit as a fiddle because you're a soccer coach. and and very athletic looking, and
Hmm.
but I became aware at a certain point, your health was starting to deteriorate, and you knew what was going on by that point. Now, at what point did you know that you were a candidate for an actual new heart?
That didn't happen until a little bit later because at first we had to figure out what the root cause was. And
Right.
so the genetic testing really hadn't been that well developed when I first ended up, because my first pacemaker went in 1996.
Okay.
And so at the time, the genetic testing was not to the point yet where they could pinpoint what the problems were. So later on, I ended up getting some genetic testing done when it just didn't seem to be getting better. It continued to get worse. I thought, well, this really needs to be checked out. And so I had some tests done, and they found out I had a genetic condition called the Desmondopathy. Desmond is effectively it's a mutation of the Desmond gene, which turns out it was a hereditary condition from my ancestors. They had when we did some research on it, we found out that they had traced this back to the early 1800s.
In your
It was
family?
in my family back
Okay.
in I'm originally from the Netherlands.
But
And
you didn't know anything about it.
didn't know anything about it, and but yeah, that they'd been around since the early 1800s, and it was a something that's called autosomal dominant, and it was fully penetrant, and it was 50% autosomal dominant, meaning 50% of your ancestors will get that same of your offspring will have that same mutation. So ultimately, we ended up having to get the kids tested as well, because the likelihood is that half the kids would have the same mutation, and it also meant that we knew effectively what the prognosis was. Eventually, that I would need a heart transplant. There was nothing was going to fix that. Genetic engineering and some of the other technologies had not been developed enough yet at the time. So from the moment that we found out that I had this genetic mutation, it was really a matter of surviving and staying as healthy as possible along the way until I was eligible to get on the transplant list and eventually eligible to get a new heart.
Because that's obviously a big deal because there's people on the list ahead of you. So
Yeah.
what was that like? Just from, I guess, an emotional level, you
was-
find out you need to go on a list, and the list is how long?
First of all, is you don't get on the list,
Right.
and so
You have to apply, or
here's the dilemma: is you have to be healthy enough to get on the list. You're healthy enough so you would be able to survive a transplant.
so young enough? Kind
Yeah,
of thing?
yeah, young enough.
So they might
healthy
not
enough,
do that with an 85-year-old.
No, at the same time, you have to be sick enough and urgent enough to make the transplant list. So it's a conundrum that
Right.
it seems almost impossible to solve. How can you be sick enough yet healthy enough
So
at the same time?
You needed it, but you were too healthy.
That's part of the problem.
Right.
And because a lot of the criteria for getting onto a transplant list are related to urgency. And so, of course, urgency, it's sort of like brinksmanship. How close are you to the edge? How close are you to dying? How urgent is it that you get a transplant? And there are other criteria, of course. There are standards that they set, like if you need to be living a reasonably healthy life, so you can't be smoking like a chimney, drinking like a fish. These are all things that you have to be careful. Of course, I didn't do that anyway. I led what I'd say a fairly, I'm going to say, boring and very, very proper life. Always looked at nutrition, always looked at exercise. And so at the same time, there's nothing you can do about genetic deterioration of your heart. And so that was tough. And so once I got onto the transplant waiting list, effectively onto the list, then it was a matter of staying healthy enough until a heart became available.
Right. And do they give you a sense of how long it could? They just give you. It could be a year. It could be 10 years.
It could be 10 years. I would have probably no longer been here.
Right.
But yeah, you don't know. And the hardest part of the journey was actually the waiting. There is nothing you can do. And when you're an active individual and you like to solve problems, I went to engineering school. Problems are there to be solved. This is what we do. And here's an intractable and unsolvable problem. And so it was a very, very frustrating time sitting there waiting for a phone call. And I remember there were some parts of that journey at 1 year. So I'd been waiting for 12 months and had heard nothing. The phone did not ring. And I know that people wait for years for kidneys. People wait sometimes for years.
But you were confident you were on the list, though? Or?
I was on the list.
Yeah.
You have to stay on the list as well. So every once in a while, things would go wrong. You end up in the hospital. If you catch an infection to take you off the list, then you have to get back on the list. It's not a simple sort of process. So you try very hard to stay on the list. And that can be for physical reasons. It could be for mental reasons. And so you have to stay strong to stay on the list. And that part of the journey was hard. The not being in control, not being able to solve the problem, and staying alive.
Now, I probably met you in about 2007.
Yep.
So where would you have been on the journey at that point?
I would have been deteriorating. My heart would have been deteriorating. My condition would have been reducing. Basically, my heart would have the right side of my heart would have been turning more into effectively a bag. What happens too when you other things start happening when you are paced as much as I was. So I had that pacemaker in already by that time. So it was about 10 years, 11 years, something like that. And about that. And what happens is when you're paced on, it's typically it's on one side of your heart. And so the right side of my heart was the problem effectively. So that's getting paced. But then the left side of your heart tends to respond with that second part of the beat a little bit later than it normally would. So slowly the left side of your heart also gets affected. And that causes all kinds of other things to happen. And people might misdiagnose that and think the problem is on the left side of the heart. All these things started happening. So then you have to look for other solutions for that. So it's the journey itself is not without sort of complications. But in 2007, that started happening. The impact was starting to go to the left side of my heart as well.
So when did you actually have the transplant then?
That was in 2012, December 2012.
So I knew you during that time. I think there was a period leading up to that. Then your health really deteriorated.
Yeah,
probably you aged about 30 years, probably, right?
And that was exactly when you say you aged 30 years. That's exactly what happens. Basically, between and I again, like I said, engineer, I map all these things out. I had a line. Basically, you run out of energy. You have to shrink your world, and you have to do that. I'd say there's a concept in IT called graceful degradation. And so when a system crashes, it looks like it crashes, but there's still a process going on behind the scenes that makes sure all your data doesn't get lost and all that, in theory. So I thought as a person, you also want to do that by design. So I started having less and less clients out of town, less and less contacts with people. I could walk. So you do this sort of mentally and you do this physically. So I could hardly, at one point, Jim, I could hardly get up a curb. I would have to lift my leg physically with my hands to get up a curb. Going up and down a staircase would take me, I don't know, 20 minutes.
And you're thinking clearly during this whole time. You know exactly what's happening.
Yes.
And it's not fun, obviously.
No.
And you have a young family and a business that's your own. So what kinds of, like, let's say 2007 to 12, what kind of, you kind of alluded to that. What kind of decisions did you have to make? So you pulled back from
my networks.
But that's also your income.
That's my bread and butter. Absolutely. And so I was very, very lucky. I had some clients that were amazing during that time. So I would, of course, you end up in the hospital. You try and stay out of the hospital as much as possible, but you end up in the hospital. At one point, I was in the hospital for 3 weeks straight. I didn't get outside. And when you're used to being active and being outside and really enjoy people, as you're shrinking your life into a much smaller space, these things get harder and harder. But I had one client, they actually would, because my mind was still working fine. My mind is the same age that
Mm-hmm.
it always seemed to be. My body and the rest of me seemed to be deteriorating at a rapid clip. They would come to the hospital. I would have my laptop just across on one of those tables at the hospital bed. They would bring sushi. The food's not always great in the hospitals. They would bring some food, and we would do work there. So again, I was very, very lucky, and so I was able to continue to have an income through that whole process. Not everyone is so lucky.
Sure. Now, leading up to 2012,
Yep.
was there a time where you were aware that you were a low number on the list, or how does that work?
Well, there's many stories here, of course.
Yes.
And what happened is there's a lot going on in on the kidney side that doesn't always get shared with the heart side, and so there's even these silos in the medical system where I feel there could be a lot more collaboration between the various organ transplant areas.
These are the donor community or whatever. How would you describe it?
Even within the hospitals.
Transplant.
So the transplant, the transplant community within hospitals, and so what we found out is that the state that I was actually, the likelihood of me finding a compatible donor had shrunk to the point where there were only going to be 8 or 9% of the available hearts were going to be a possible match for me.
So what's that, size and blood type and age? Or?
All of that sort
Okay.
of compatibility of the heart.
Okay.
And so given that suddenly moves you from the general sort of transplant population on the list to a much more urgent part of that list. So I moved right up to a very high level, and I don't know what it was. I think whether it's the top 2 or 3. And what happens then?
Because your health was failing enough.
And because it was so unlikely I was going to find a compatible donor heart, that also meant that I went on the national list. Vicky, it's again back to the people in your family, the people that are your friends. Vicky had talked to someone who had a friend who happened to be on the kidney side, who then suggested that this compatibility test be done. They found out, oops, you should have been on the national list probably 8 months ago. And so, again, it's through these connections. I know you mentioned the word connections right at the beginning, and it is through all these connections. It's about people and finding the right information. And I probably should have been on that list quite a bit before the time that I was. Doesn't matter. In the end, I feel I got the right heart. It's incredible. It's been amazing ever since I had that heart.
But you were wearing
implanted.
what, a pager or something at a certain point?
I had my cell phone. They did have pagers. They were kind of going out of style because everyone had moved on. These pagers were sort of like an old technology,
Right.
and so in the end, I always had my cell phone on with me, and
So you just got a phone call.
I got a phone call, and not only that, it's like we had a phone call just on our home phone, and Vicky was sitting upstairs. I think she was doing math homework with Taba, so she wasn't answering the phone because he had to stay focused. And and I happened to be down in the basement. I'd worked my way downstairs. I hadn't been there for probably a month, and so I was down in the basement, and the phone in my sweatpants rang, and it was just, I didn't know what number it was. I answered, and a lady just said, "We think we may have a heart for you." Oh, thank you so much. It's kind of, you don't know what to say. I mean, it's
Right.
I said, and so then I realized,
Who
of
is
course, they
this?
probably tried to call. Yeah, it was sort of a, who is this? So and I said, "Say, Vicky, maybe you should have answered that call. It looks like we need to go to the hospital." Of course, then all the panic sets in, and so
And you've been waiting years for this phone call.
yeah. So you've been, and at the time it was 20 months I waited, and
Since you knew you were on a list?
yep. Since I got on that list
Okay.
and
But
stayed
you've
on the
been
list.
more than 20 months overall, really.
Oh yeah, well,
Right.
since
Years.
years, because just to get on the list took a long,
Years.
long time.
Okay.
And so then of course it was. I said, "That's okay. I mean, you're not supposed to drive yourself to the hospital, but I said I want to make sure we get there." Vicky kind of organized things. I drove to the hospital, and it was a very strange experience there because
What hospital are we talking about?
Toronto General,
Okay.
so it's University Health Network.
Right.
And because there isn't really a simple procedure. So they sort of say, yep, come into the hospital, just check into admissions, and then they'll sort you. But it's not all the time that they get, hi, I'm here for a transplant, And so meanwhile, you're trying to park. It's not easy in a downtown hospital. There's other logistics to deal with. And then you sort of go through this process, and you're a bit in the twilight zone. It's
and your adrenaline is off the charts. At this point,
it is,
probably,
and
right?
because you're in a different world, and
That's why they don't want you to drive. Probably it's like
well, no, my head was absolutely fine at the time. When you get there, again, the thing plus to me these are just factual things. I don't worry too much. I would watch my own transplant. It wouldn't bother me. I've always, because I'm fascinated by the process. It's you don't know. You haven't gone through this before, so it's all kind of new. But and that the heart could arrive. They could, because they have to look at it. The surgeons, they still need to look at it. They have to make sure it's okay, that it's compatible, that it's going to work. And the surgeon himself, it was him at this time, Dr. Yao. He was, you want the best technician known to man, of course. You want someone that's done this a few times. And I remember in the very first meeting, he said, well, this will be my first one. He's just joking, but you worry about these things a little bit, right? But this guy was incredible. He was very, very good. In fact, you can see him on YouTube. I think he had like a YouTube video on heart transplants.
Well, I mean, when I was a kid, heart transplants were front page news in the newspaper, right? This is no small feat.
Nope.
Obviously. So let's go back to those days, though. You're allowed to talk about the circumstances of where the heart came from and that sort of thing?
Yep. Well, the way that process is different for every province. And turns out my heart came from Nova Scotia. And you hear that by, I ask questions. I talk to assistants of surgeons. I wanted to find out as much as I could. You could also hear nurses talking. I knew the heart had flown in from somewhere. Then I heard the word, Halifax. I also heard, it's a young person. So all those things you sort of glean from conversations. And of course, the internet's pretty amazing, so you can look for things that have happened.
And this is all while you're waiting for your surgery?
Some of that's while waiting, some of it's afterwards.
Right.
I made sure to thank the surgeon afterwards. I called his office, and they're just very, very happy that you got a good heart and it's going well and all that. So even in those conversations, you glean a little bit here and there, and then you can look things up on the internet to see what has happened. And but the way the system actually works is in Ontario, you can send a letter. It goes to Trillium, Gift of Life. They redact out anything that you're not supposed to share, names, locations, all kinds of things, references. They redact that out. They send that letter to their equivalent organization in Nova Scotia. That organization then looks at that, sends it to the family, and then the family responds in the same way. So it's very much choreographed and again redacted along the way. So what happens? You get a letter from the family that has a lot of blanks in it. They were clearly also trying to share names and locations, but they were all redacted out. So you get sort of a halting letter, and you have to figure out, because contacting a donor family, it was their loss, right?
Yeah.
And so you have to be very, very careful. You don't want to bring up trauma again. You don't want to cause undue stress on those families. So you have to have a pretty good indication as to whether or not they want contact.
Right.
And so it seemed in the first letter that they might not.
Right.
So then I thought, okay, because I hadn't really been ready to write the letter for almost a year after the surgery. It was just something in my head that I wasn't ready to face it, and the potential of that contact or to write a letter. And I felt a little stilted writing it. It's an emotional thing. And so how do you convey that? You want to thank the family, of course. I mean, it's an amazing gift. So that exchange, there were two exchanges of letters. But the second exchange, the second time that we got a letter from the donor family, and it's now 6 years hence, almost 7 years hence. That one had like a little smiley face on there that didn't get redacted out. I thought, okay.
These are handwritten letters?
No, these are typed. They're like email.
Emoji or something.
Yeah, it was a little smiley face emoji, and that hadn't been redacted. So I thought, okay, so maybe they're friendly, And I thought, okay, so I thought, how am I going to contact them without really contacting them? So because I knew who they were,
right,
and
through your own sleuthing,
through my own sleuthing. Yeah, it was fairly straightforward.
Because it was in the news. Was it in the news?
It was in the news.
Out there?
Yeah,
there was an accident.
There was an accident,
right.
and someone was airlifted to the hospital, and
right.
And it turns out that was a hospital right across the street from where my son had his place at Dalhousie University. So
right.
I knew exactly where it all sort of happened.
Right.
And then so I could see on Google Earth, I could see the cemetery where he was buried, and it was related to a church. So I thought I'll send an email to the pastor.
Right.
And so I said, here's all my information. Can you please convey it to the family? If they would like contact, then please feel free to do so. And then, so I didn't hear anything for a couple of weeks, but then suddenly I was sitting at Union Station. I was heading back on the GO train to come back to Oakville, and the phone rings, and it was the father of the young man whose heart I had, so Stephen.
Wow.
And yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
it
gets real at a certain point.
Yeah.
So how long? This wasn't that long ago. 6 years later. So
yeah, 7. Yeah, and in the end, it was 7 years. And so just before COVID, so we ended up sort of communicating back and forth, just Facebook, and got to know the family a little bit, and they really wanted us to come out, and so we ended up. Vicki and I decided, okay, let's go do that. It turns out that Stephen, whose heart I have, also saved 3 other people. And so there's a liver guy, a kidney guy, and a pancreas guy, and they're all connected to the family. The family knows them all. So when we went, we didn't know what to expect, because you hear all the stories. It can go wrong. You can have strange connections, and it can be a lot of stress. The family might see you as their son and treat you that way, and so we were aware of some of the potential downfalls, but none of that really happened. And so we got on a plane, we flew to Halifax, we rented a car, drove down, we stopped at Peggy's Cove for a nice sort of clam chowder lunch, and then took a deep breath and drove down to a place called Quinnen, and so not too far from Yarmouth.
And for them, enough time perhaps had passed that they had processed a lot of that.
That and the fact that they were already very closely connected, especially to the gentleman that got Stephen's liver, and so they already had those relationships in place, and they would have liked to have connected much sooner, and so that would have been nice. But they were unbelievably open people, open-hearted, open-armed, and so when we drove up the driveway, knocked on the door, and sorry.
No, I understand. No,
it was very emotional, and so we just hugged them, and they said, and we got to know them a little bit, and they said, is it okay? We've invited some people over. Is that okay? And we said, sure, why not? And what we didn't know is how many family members there were living close in that community, and they all, of course, knew about it. So
they knew you were coming.
We met probably 35, 40 people, aunts, uncles, friends, family, grandmas, grandpas, and it was an incredible experience, just wonderful family.
And gave them some peace, no doubt.
Yeah, and they listened to my heart. A number of them were nurses, and they had stethoscopes, and it was superb. Yeah.
So let's go back to 2012, though.
Yep.
So did you need special medication? Like I always hear about things being rejected and that sort of thing. Was that?
Yep.
So that's another obstacle, another hurdle to jump, no doubt, right?
Yeah, and it was again the whole So once you get a transplant, that's the first thing you focus on is make sure that you don't reject your heart. So I always thought, oh, you have to accept it in many ways. And so, I read all the sort of materials on that. You have to accept it in your mind, you have to accept it in your body, and then you have to make sure that you also take anti-rejection drugs. So I remember waking up, and it was a very strange thing. I hadn't really heard my own heartbeat since I had my pacemaker put in, because something changes in the way that you hear your own heart, or for me anyway. And so when I woke up, and I was probably still under the influence of whatever medications they'd given me, but I was lying with my ear on the pillow, and suddenly I realized I can hear my own heartbeat. And so then it got me thinking, you know how sometimes some music will sound like that? It was like music. And then I thought, okay, so they tell you how you're supposed to accept the heart. I said, okay, first I have to get to know this heart. It's new to my body. And I thought, okay, why don't I try some different types of music to see how the heart reacts? Because hearts are about rhythm, about sort of connecting. And so I tried all these different types of music, and I thought that way I'll know if the heart came from someone that likes certain kinds of music. Or I know this makes no scientific sense.
How old was he?
Turns out he was around 30.
Okay.
Young lad. And through that I thought, he likes all kinds of music. I tried classical, Norwegian heavy metal, everything, the whole gambit. The heart seemed fine with all of it, and I thought, okay, it was probably a guy. I don't know if you ever watched Archie Bunker.
Of course. Yes.
But, and there was an episode when he was talking to Meathead and realized that, Meathead said, no, you could get the heart of a black person.
Right.
And I remember that episode and his, Archie Bunker, his jaw dropped open, just that sort of possibility. But it got me thinking. I thought it would be really cool if you got, say, a black person, or say a black female's heart. Would that mean anything or do anything? Would that change anything? Yes. Right? Would you be more open? Would you? And of course, that's all a kind of fanciful thinking. But the idea of having someone else's heart inside you, I think it is worth thinking about it a lot. And and of course, in the end, he was a wonderful young lad, and he was a seaman. So he was first officer on supply ships for Maersk, a shipping company, and used to bring supplies to the offshore oil platforms off of the coast of Newfoundland. And so he'd been in boating and sailing, just like his dad and his grandpa. And so I love that sort of boating connection too. And so I felt right away that I was connected to the heart, and that it was sort of meant to be. And ultimately,
so you're confident from day one that it was going to work.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, even if it's somewhat irrational, it's
doesn't matter.
You just believed
right?
it.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter. I'm not particularly religious, but these things, you have to accept it, because otherwise, and you have to go through that process, whatever that means for you, and it's different for everybody. Mm-hmm. And I felt in the end that even going to visit them, that was meant to be. All is, and I know his mom's the same age as I am, and so she felt that Stephen had chosen his recipients, that it was meant to be, and yeah, whatever that means, however that works, I'm very, very lucky to have gotten that heart. So even though I was frustrated, I should have been on that national list, yes, 8 months or blah, blah, blah.
Well, you're reborn in some respects,
it's
right?
Unbelievable,
Speaking
right?
of religion, right?
And so you can't discount that. I think you can't discount sort of the mental aspects of it, and the meaning behind all of that. But yeah, I have a brand new life.
But in those first few months, did you just bounce back right away, or was there some?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jim, but there's medicine involved, right?
There is. And so you have anti-rejection drugs. You have biopsies. So when you after you have your transplant, they need to make sure it's working, that it's continuing to work, that you're not building up scar tissue inside the heart. So the way they do that, they actually send so you go for a biopsy, they send a little wire through your vein, goes into the heart. It basically takes little pieces out of the inside of your heart and then tests them to make sure that there's that there's no rejection forming. The first time we went, we got there early, so we got to Toronto General, and there was a gentleman standing there, and he was very upright, looked very energetic, and he was ready to go. And then it was us. It was Vicky and I, and so I had a little chat with the guy, and he was full of energy. It'd been 2 years since his transplant. He was going to hit country number 50. He was traveling all around the world. He'd already done 49 different countries in total, and he was so wow. I thought, that's the model after 2 years. I'm going to do 60 countries. You know, it was sort of like, oh, I could see that model, and that was a model that I thought I could look for and aspire to, and then it was myself.
Was this relief that you just survived the operation, perhaps, or were you actually feeling physically that good?
I was feeling very, very good. What happened?
You felt good immediately,
Jim. What? Yeah, and the reason is because you've been walking around without proper amounts of oxygen going through your bloodstream for so many years that you have zero energy. There's no energy transfer. And so as soon as that heart goes in, it's pumping oxygen all through your veins.
right?
And I felt I could fly. I wanted to stand to eat. I didn't want to sit down anymore because suddenly it's as if someone just, like you said, a shot of adrenaline's been, and it's a permanent shot of adrenaline. You become so used to being running at 30, 40% capacity or less.
So
And suddenly you're at 80 or 90% capacity. It's like the weight's gone off your shoulder. You feel like you can fly. It is an incredible experience. And
now, I somewhere, I don't know when I ran into, but it was somewhere, there was suddenly you were just at a school function
yeah,
and you were just there in the hallway, and there's Rienk, and I hadn't seen you. I'm not close enough for you. We're not close enough friends that I would be visiting you in the hospital, and sadly, but I guess I could have. But I remember there's Rienk, and I give you a big hug. There's probably a lot of people giving you a lot of hugs, so you probably wouldn't remember. But it's on some level, it's kind of a miracle. I mean, it's a miracle of science, and
absolutely.
You're there walking, and you're here to tell the story, kind of thing. But was there? I mean, you said you were feeling great. Right? Were you better in 6 months? Better in a year? Better in 2 years? Or did
you keep getting better? But the first that first change it's transformative change. You're and also you then realize, because for 17 years you've been on a downward slope, and you could map it, and you have little bumps along the way, but everything is down.
Right.
So now you get a transplant, and suddenly you're on this upward slope. So it's just mentally and physically, you're now, there's this great hope where you're sort of heading towards despair. You can calculate, I'm going to be dead in 3 months, or I'm going to be dead in 4 months. You could map that out, and now it's wow. I feel like I could go back to the Olympics now.
And that's 9 years ago now, right?
Yeah, that's that was in December 2012. So almost 9 years. It'll be 9 years in December.
The sad part is it's potentially genetic, and your kids potentially have the same condition, right? Which they have to consider.
Well, we have to look back. First of all, doing that sort of, once we found out it was a genetic problem, that explained why my dad died very young. He was 30.
Okay.
Or 29, I think he wasn't quite 30 yet. My aunt died at about 55, I think she was, and she was one of the first pacemaker recipients in the Netherlands. She was, I think, number 7 or 8, and in fact, she had one that was powered by plutonium, so she wasn't allowed to go close to airports. She was a nuclear-powered. She had a nuclear-powered pacemaker at the time, but it explained why my grandma died young, and back through my family history, why they all died young, and why I would have also died young. I'm the first one in that line that has been able to, through this transplant, to survive. beyond the age of 52, 53, 54, 55, so that's the one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is we also now know what it is. So, a couple of my kids also have this genetic condition, and so
They got tested.
yeah, they got tested. They wanted to get tested. All the kids wanted to get tested. It's you have to think about that very carefully, because as soon as you do, there are different laws in different countries in terms of what that means in terms of ever getting insurance, let's say, or
Right.
or you may not even want to know, because I lived a great life. I didn't know. I didn't know till much later, and I wouldn't trade my life for the world, even if I would have died at the age of 50 something. That's okay. I wouldn't have traded in my life. But once you know, you might do things differently. So you have to make that decision sort of consciously. The older two kids was one thing. They were old enough. The younger one, we made sure that she thought through it a couple of times, and then made a decision also to get tested. So all three of them were tested, and two of the three have the mutation. So the good news is if they have children, they can test for that now in vitro. So then it still makes it very, very difficult, because let's say my mother would have known.
Yes.
And you get into these very, very difficult ethical situations, and what would she have done? So these are, so it gets into a whole host of questions and decisions that do make it difficult.
Might there be anything in the future where the solution isn't a transplant, or
Absolutely. I
something
think
else?
there's an awful lot going on in
Right.
research. Genetic engineering certainly is one thing where maybe they can adjust those things and so that before it exhibits itself, that they can make adjustments so it doesn't come out in the same way, and it doesn't actually activate. So I'm hoping that more and more research will be done in that area.
So now you're involved in research, post-operative research. So tell me about the Canadian Donation and Transplantation and Research Program. That's what you're involved in. So is that you and other patients
Yes.
are being kind of more activist? Is that how you?
Very much more involved in basically setting the direction for research, and also prioritizing funding. One of the frustrations I had in this entire journey, and it is not a simple journey, is that patients don't really have much to say.
Right.
The healthcare system is very, very reactive. So once you have a problem and it's urgent, boom, you go in, they help you, they fix that problem, bang, you're out. And that makes for a very bumpy ride, a very painful ride. And I don't think that's really helpful for either the medical people, professionals that are helping, or the patients. And then you have a group of academics as well that are focusing on their areas. A couple of things in academia that have been very, very frustrating. One is how little collaboration there is. We had to do all that research in terms of my condition, this particular desmopathy, because a lot of it was happening in the place in Northern Holland where my family is from and where my ancestors are from, because that's where the big problem is. So the research was going on at the University of Groningen. Now, the researchers trying to get their research out, trying to get funding for that research, and they may not want to collaborate with too many people around the rest of the world. So there's very little information sharing that goes on naturally, or in the past, certainly that's been the case. What the cdtrp is trying to do is change that. So it's very much a collaborative approach between researchers, and it's done also with the collaboration of patients. So when there's funding going on, patients have a say in terms of the priority of the funding. Priority for funding things that are practical for patients, and so that are actually important to patients. That journey. So helping patients through that journey, both on the mental health side and also on the physical side, nutrition, exercise, to make sure that the aim ultimately is more of a long-term quality of life. So the focus becomes on that, not on here's a problem, I fixed it, see you later, I'm done, or having research done in isolation, which is then published somewhere where people may or may not see it. So what I really like about the program is it brings those parties together to focus things much more on patients. And, the assumption that the patient's just someone that comes in, you fix them and you send them off, and they don't have much to contribute. I think in the past, the doctor knows best, I think is no longer has a place in society. I think we're beyond that now, and I think we can do a lot better. And I think CDTRP is doing that. The system, for all its flaws, in Canada is not bad, and you're super lucky you've gotten someone's heart. Not only that, you've got a couple of children who are also going to go through this journey. So you feel at a certain point like you also have a responsibility to give something back and to provide input to make that journey easier for future generations and for other people that have to go through this, and also to help physicians and medical professionals be more effective in the types of things that they do, or allocate budgets and finances in the places where they actually can make a real difference.
Just want to thank you, Rienk, for sharing your story.
Yeah, no problem. I really appreciate the chance to talk about this, Jim. Thank you.